Hello everyone, welcome back. Crowdfunding is an increasingly popular alternative to traditional funding source. A lot of early stage startup, even fast-growing companies have been using crowdfunding to gather funds from audiences who are interested in their products or services. Today we have Hannah, the founder of the Funding Crowd, to discuss some of the questions and opportunities we have about crowdfunding. Hannah has previously worked with a lot of crowdfunding campaigns, and she is an expert in this area. Hello, Hannah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So do you want to quickly give us an introduction about yourself and your experience about crowdfunding?
Yeah, sure. So my involvement in crowdfunding actually started at university when I was doing a university project. And at that time in the UK, it was still really new and emerging. And so I got this opportunity to work on a really new area that was really interesting. And the more I was talking, researching the area, talking to startups, I realized there was a massive demand for more support. There was lots of founders that thought that crowdfunding would be good for them, but they just didn't know where to start. And having accumulated this knowledge through my research, I realized that I could be that person to provide that support. So 2 years ago, I started the Funding Crowd to help founders take advantage of crowdfunding. And since then, we've done over 50 successful crowdfunding campaigns. And in 2020 alone, we've had our best year and raised over $3 million for startups.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Thank you so much for this talk today. I met you through the Eagle Labs in Berkeley, and it was your advice to me about my startup was really, really helpful. So, because I was also, wondering a lot about, is crowdfunding suitable for everyone? What type of company should consider crowdfunding?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think this is often the first step that's the hardest, seeing lots of a huge variety of companies using crowdfunding and wondering if it's right for me. Whether crowdfunding is right depends on the type of model. And I think we'll talk about this in more detail later. But in general, the main ones are rewards-based crowdfunding like Kickstarter and equity-based where you give away a percentage of your company. Now, for both of them in general, really it comes down to whether you can offer a good incentive. So for equity crowdfunding, you obviously need to show that any shares that people are buying are going to increase in value, and that's the incentive that you're offering. And if you can't really show that yet, then equity crowdfunding probably isn't right for you. For rewards-based crowdfunding, it's the same. It comes down to the incentive. If you can offer a product or some kind of valuable incentive that people can't get anywhere else, that they get a good discount for, and they're really excited by, then it's likely the rewards-based crowdfunding could be right for you.
Okay. So is crowdfunding success rate high for, both reward or equity? What are the pros and cons using crowdfunding as a funding source?
Sure. So unfortunately, no, the success rate isn't high. It's in fact very low. So it's a split between 2/3 of companies that raise on crowdfunding sites tend to fail, and a third reach their funding goal. And that does vary depending on the model. So equity crowdfunding has a higher success rate compared to rewards-based crowdfunding. But in general, you're always looking at more companies failing than succeeding. And that really represents one of the major cons, which is that it's high risk. You have a set time limit in general. It's a very kind of public-facing approach as well. So you put in a lot of time and effort to try and limit the risk of hosting under that time frame that you have for crowdfunding. But inevitably, there is lots of uncertainty around it, and you can end up wasting a lot of time. And also, another con is doing that on a very public platform.
Right.
The pros, however, is that it's a lot more accessible in general. So if we talk about equity crowdfunding, you can go on equity crowdfunding, upload your video, a pitch, and you are available for crowdfunding and to accept investment. But for funding streams like angel investment, it's a lot more networks driven. And so crowdfunding is really good for being kind of a marketing tool, being more accessible, allowing you to test demand. And in general, it's just another option for founders. And I think that's a big pro.
Okay. So apart from these two, types that we said, how many types out there and what are them? For company to kind of consider what type they should go for, what are the things that you think a company should consider?
Sure. So we mentioned the two big ones, and these are the ones that I mainly work on, which is rewards-based and equity-based.
Right.
But there's actually 3 others. One of them is donation-based crowdfunding, and this is just more commonly known as charitable giving. So the idea is that someone gives to a crowdfunding campaign with no expectation of return.
Right, right.
And then the final two are very different. So one of them is called lending-based crowdfunding, and this is when you essentially try and get a loan from the crowd. So platforms such as the Funding Circle allow you to apply for a loan, and then if you get that loan, it will be made up of lots and lots of different contributions, and the interest you pay will be split across those people. And then the final one is crypto crowdfunding, which is relatively new compared to the rest of the models and relatively volatile because of different regulation. But basically it works by basically creating a digital currency. For example, if you're a babysitting business, you might create a baby coin, and then you sell it in return for Bitcoin. And by getting the Bitcoin, you're raising money for your business. The idea being that as your business grows, the value of baby coin will increase. So those are the 5 models. Sorry, you had another question as well. What was that again? Sorry, I forgot.
Oh, I was thinking like what kind of, so for a company to think about what type they should go for, like what are the things that they should consider?
Yeah, sure. So it comes down to the same things I was talking about in terms of incentive. That is definitely a big thing. But that's really focused on donation rewards and equity, which have very similar dynamics. You know, they're time constraint. You post on a platform and then it's very public, and then you have a time frame and you see if you can get the funding that you need. Lending based and crypto crowdfunding is slightly different. And I would say in order to really give detail over which of those types of crowdfunding is right for you, you kind of move into a very different area of investment. You know, talk about whether you want to take on debt, whether you have the technology to support cryptocurrency, and that gets quite complicated. I imagine most people watching this video are more interested in the first 3, and I think it comes back down to incentive. What incentive can you offer? Is it something that people really want and will be willing to take a risk on and contribute to your business?
Gotcha. Okay. Could you recommend some of the platforms that are popular and have the big user base? I guess for the other 2 that we mentioned, perhaps there aren't a lot of popular platforms available for those 2 types yet, or there are also some. But I know that for example, like equity-based or donation-based or reward-based, there are quite a few. Would you mind recommending some of those to us?
Yeah, sure. So for donation-based, I think the one that most people are familiar with is GoFundMe. That's definitely the biggest, has the biggest international audience. But then there's also lots of other ones. There's actually over kind of 1,000 crowdfunding platforms worldwide, and that is growing. So I'm just mentioning kind of some of the biggest. Other donation-based are Crowdfunder in the UK and Just Giving and Virgin Money Giving. So those are probably ones that people are kind of familiar with, and I would encourage using since they're probably popular. For rewards-based crowdfunding, the biggest platforms are Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and they have an international audience. So you're able to buy and also post from any country in the world, and as a consequence, they have a really big global audience. Equity crowdfunding, the regulation across different countries varies significantly. So not many equity crowdfunding platforms in any country have a real international audience. I think that is changing. But in general, there's not one that has, the biggest. You have US-based and UK-based, etc. In the UK, you have Crowdcube and Seedrs, which are the main platforms, but they are soon to merge. So we'll have one single dominating equity crowdfunding site in the UK.
Are any of those crowdfunding free for like they don't charge fee for companies to use them for crowdfunding campaign, or they do like most of them charge an admin fee?
So the vast majority charge fees. In some cases, so for example on GoFundMe, if you're in an accident or you have a health emergency, they don't charge fees on that. And Crowdfunder recently have been removing fees for any COVID-19 related projects. So there are these circumstances where fees are reduced or waived, but in general, you're expecting to pay fees. So there's definitely costs associated with raising on these platforms.
Okay, and how much normally they would charge, if you know?
So to give kind of a blanket figure for across the industry, you're looking at about 5%. But for Crowdcube and Seedrs, that is higher. And in general, equity crowdfunding has higher fees, and they're more like 7%, including payment processing fees as well.
Okay. Well, my next question is about those platforms, like, because I guess a lot of people, companies are kind of having this hope or kind of illusion or thoughts about, people will just go on the platform and the donors will just donate. I was wondering, like, will people actually browse on those platforms and donate? How organic are those platforms?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and really it's kind of a common misconception that you put your campaign up there and then people will come. And that doesn't really happen, in answer to your question. So yes, there is likely to be some organic traffic on your campaign. For equity crowdfunding, Crowdcube and Seeders, the marketplaces are, they're competitive, but they're not very crowded. So in general, someone looking to invest in a startup, you'll get good visibility regardless of where you are on their page. And in general, you're looking at kind of at least 20% you'll get from organic browsing, which is relatively quite high for crowdfunding. But for rewards-based crowdfunding, it's very highly dependent on whether you get, how the beginning of your crowdfunding campaign goes, whether you pay for any promotions on the platform, because those platforms are a lot busier and a lot more competitive. And ultimately, if you don't do very well at the beginning, so if you don't show initial traction and initial excitement, or if you don't hit certain milestones, the crowdfunding platform won't promote you on their homepage and on certain pages, and you'll basically be lost. So if you do everything right, then you can get up to kind of 30% on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, but honestly, that's quite rare. You more expect to have to bring about 90% of your pledges to the platform as opposed to getting them from the platform organically.
Okay. Well, it sounds quite low, high, or like, lower than, I guess, how a lot of people would expect. So where should a company start? Like, what are the main things for company to consider in order to have a successful campaign?
Sure. So the first thing I always recommend is giving yourself visibility. So I've talked a lot about the riskiness of crowdfunding, and that you can't post your campaign and expect stuff to happen. So you need to do some marketing to start with, but that process can feel a little bit overwhelming. And so what I always suggest starting with is just thinking about, okay, if I was to launch right now, who would my customers be? Who would my investors be? How much would they contribute, and why would they contribute? What were the things that were going to really entice them to contribute? Once you do that, you have a good idea of how much you need to kind of raise awareness. For example, if you wanted to raise 10 grand and you realize you've got kind of 2 grand within your existing network, you've got to raise 8 grand, you've got to pull 8 grand onto the platform. So giving yourself that visibility is definitely where to start, because that gives you firstly a kind of monetary idea of what you need to raise. It secondly gives you an idea of what you've attracted so far. So the kind of people that are already engaging with you have done so for a reason, and that represents the kind of messaging that you're good at portraying and the kind of reasons that people like to engage with you, and that'll be representative of what you want to emulate in the rest of your campaign. So by giving yourself visibility, you get that quantitative idea, you get a good idea of messaging that you need to use, and you also get a good idea of what the incentives you need to offer on your campaign are. So to kind of consolidate that, the first step is to really think about, if I was to launch right now, how much would I get, who would contribute, and why would they contribute?
Okay. So we mentioned a little bit about the marketing and I guess spending a bit of money on the marketing. So I guess company should spend money on their crowdfunding campaign, but how much should they spend and what should they spend on?
Sure. So this is very highly dependent on what model you're using, how much you want to raise, and also about your existing network to start with. So I'm going to kind of give you an example, because in general, this is when most people will be thinking about costs, and that's in the context of rewards-based crowdfunding. Yeah. Equity-based crowdfunding, you can spend money on ads, you can spend money on press, but there's no real clear data on how much you should spend versus how much investment you get. So that's not really useful, me providing that. But for rewards-based crowdfunding, Facebook ads have been shown to be very instrumental in getting you the funding that you need. In general, you're expecting, if you're trying to raise over 10 grand, you're expecting to raise need about 20% of that target to be spent on Facebook ads alone. So that doesn't count anything extra that you want to pay. For example, if you want to hire a crowdfunding consultant, PR agency, if you want an agency to run your ads for you, if you want a videographer, and these are all additional costs. How much they are depends on the quality that you want, and also depends on your in-house capacity. So of course, if you have a marketing team already, you won't need to hire a marketing agency. But I think the big question most people have is how much will I have to spend on ads? And in general, I see 20% is the minimum you need to spend based on how much you want to raise.
Right. Okay. Do you think that crowdfunding might be harder to secure the fund because the impact of COVID?
So this is a tricky question. I think on the surface, and that's definitely what I was thinking at the beginning, surely it's going to be harder to raise because people are going to be less interested in taking risks in terms of equity investment. They probably don't have as much disposable income to spend on cool products on Kickstarter. And in general, there has been a dip on rewards-based sites on how much is being contributed on those platforms. But in equity crowdfunding, while there was an initial dip kind of in March in the UK when we first went into lockdown, it actually seems to have recovered to pretty standard levels actually in the last few months. So I'd say the main reason to decide whether to crowdfund right now should be less on the circumstances, because I think it's hard to predict, and more on both your own personal circumstances and also on what you think you would raise right now. So that idea of visibility over what you would raise.
Okay. Well, now it's our last question for today is that what is your personal advice for a company wanting to launch a crowdfunding campaign?
So my personal advice is, we've talked about giving yourself visibility. That's the main piece of advice I have. I think one step before that as well is really thinking about, is crowdfunding right for me? Because there are other ways to do similar things. Like you could do pre-selling, and actually, Sophia, this is something that we talked about in our session. I remember talking about whether it's worth just doing a pre-selling campaign on your own platform. Also, for example, in equity crowdfunding, angel investment, there's pros and cons with both, but you should definitely not consider crowdfunding to be an easy way to raise money. And you really want to be weighing the pros against your own kind of business's goals. So if onboarding new customers now is the right thing to do, then crowdfunding might be right for you. If you've got good press coverage, if you've got a really good incentive, then crowdfunding might be right. But also remember, it's an intensive process and it's an expensive process. And if that doesn't align with both your business's development, but also kind of your personal circumstances, then it wouldn't be the right thing to do. So as much as obviously I think crowdfunding is great and I love the model and I'm so glad it exists, a lot of people think that it's right for them when it's not. So I just encourage you to really understand the complexities of the model and the intensity of using crowdfunding, and ensure that you've got really good reasons to crowdfund.
Okay, sounds good. Well, that's all we have for today, and thank you so much for your time. We hope this section would be helpful for somebody out there, and we also put your Hannah's LinkedIn and website below. So if you have any question about crowdfunding, you're more than happy to drop her a message, and Hannah would be happy to have virtual coffee with you if you like.
Yeah,
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks,